Good morning, and thank you all for coming this morning. This morning we have a presentation I'm going to go through on long-term care. So how many people in here today have a long-term care strategy? And that strategy can include either long-term care insurance, could include letters of direction. Anybody? One? Okay. So if you have not developed a plan, the state will create one for you if you don't do it. All right. So there are different ways we're talking about different strategies and that for it, but the key being here that if you don't take care of it yourself, at some point in time, you could have the state deciding what your best interests are. And do you want that to potentially occur, that for it, right? So we start talking about long-term care. Statistically, 52% of people over age 65, that's more than half, will need long-term care. And long-term care does not mean that you have to be confined to a nursing home or that for it. It could mean that you need assistance. We'll go through later in the presentation, talks about the increase in Alzheimer's. I was reading something a couple weeks ago that was talking about how there's now thinking that people, different traits for Alzheimer's or mental cognitive impairment start earlier in some people. I have a couple of clients, one started at age 62, and then I had a physician one time where he had long-term care problems. He was an orthopedic surgeon, couldn't practice anymore for it, and he was, I think, in his early 60s as well. So it can strike at any time. Doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a certain age in that for it, right? So we start talking about what is long-term care. It's ongoing services and support needed because of chronic health conditions or disability, right? There are three levels. You can have skilled care, intermediate care, or personal care, right? So, I mean, depending on the levels that you're at for it. And care can be provided in a variety of settings. It does not have to be in a facility. How many people, if they had the choice, would rather stay at home versus going to a center or that for it? All right. Most people would, right? So as we start to get more mature, sometimes it's having to make changes within our residence, if that's where we want to be, to accommodate some of those potential issues in that way, right? So it may be having a step stool to get into the bathtub or something. It may be changing something out to be able, maybe changing a bath into a shower or something, so you've got access in that part, right? So it's not necessarily having to be in a ongoing setting, but it's somewhere where you could receive the care at home, right? An assisted living facility or other senior center that for it, adult daycare, or ultimately nursing home and that for it. Does anybody have any idea of what the costs are for nursing home care? I mean, so there's different types of care, right? So if you're in an assisted living facility, that care in the Chicago area could be anywhere between $3,000 and $4,000 a month. The more care that you're receiving, right, if you move up to either from an assisted living up to a full nursing care or mental cognitive impairment or something along those lines, and that for it, I mean, that could be running anywhere between $6,000 and $8,000 a month, right? And that could quickly deplete assets if that was the case in that for it, right? So we talk about annual nursing home cost. Average nationwide cost of a nursing home is roughly $82,000 a year. A year, $82,000 a year. So it's a little about $6,500 a month. And therefore, right, if the cost rises at an average rate of 3% a year, in 20 years, the average cost of nursing home care will be approximately $148,000 a year. Right? Now, that's one side of the coin there. There's an article that I was reading a couple weeks ago that talked about the looming caregiver crisis. So that talks about the cost of care at a 3% rate. This article was talking in terms of who's going to provide that care, right? So as the population continues to age And if the median age continues to go up, that means there may not be as many younger people with which to provide the service, right? So this is an average cost on an annual basis here across the country. If you happen to be in a retiree state, let's say Florida or Arizona, or that for it, there tends to be a propensity of higher retired individuals, correct? If that's the case, law of supply and demand comes into effect, right? If all of a sudden there are fewer people, there are more people demanding the services, and not enough people providing the services for it, what happens to that cost? The cost goes up, right? So it's obviously this is on a nationwide basis, but the cost is going to vary by location. It's going to vary by the number of people that need the care in that area for it, and the number of people that can potentially provide the care. Right? So it's one thing to be able to potentially have the care available, but who is going to provide it? And can you then afford the person that's going to provide it? Right? So these are all ongoing costs and things that we have for it. So obviously there's different ways to be able to pay for long-term care. You can obviously do a pay out of pocket, right? So you get a check, you get them a bill and pay that for it. I have a client right now that they're going through a situation. Mom's now thinking about moving to Florida to move in with the sister, right? The facility here was looking to get all of her information to be able to submit. They needed 5 years worth of records, right? So if anybody goes into an assisted living center or that for it, you need 5 years worth of records. That includes your bank accounts, that includes your brokerage, that includes anything that you have as an asset for it. The other thing I asked this particular client to check into was if mom's going to Florida, is mom going to be considered an Illinois resident or a Florida resident? Right? Because you have to be in a certain state for a certain period of time with which to be considered a resident. You know, it could be anywhere from 30 days to 180 days that you're considered a resident. So if mom's not considered a resident of Florida, is Illinois going to continue to pay for her living in Florida? I said, I don't know the answer to the question, but I think it's something you need to find out in that book, right? So it's to understand the care is going to be given there, but if she's still registered here as a resident, Florida's not going to, Illinois is not going to want to pay for her being in Florida. Florida's not going to want to pay for her being, if she's in Illinois, in that for it. So what happens to that? Right? Question. So, yes?
Is Florida one of the states where you'll have to pay income tax at the state level?
Florida has, at this point in time, has no state income tax. Okay. The other challenge with just going kind of outside in Illinois, it varies by state. In Illinois, they changed the law several years ago where if you go on Medicaid and you have a home, the state will now put a lien on the home. So it used to be that the home was excluded prior to, I think it went into effect in, I want to say 2011, 2012, for it. So the home used to be excluded. Now if you go in, you spend down your assets, the state starts using Medicaid and that for it, and you have a home, they will put a lien on the home. If there's a spouse in the home, the spouse can continue to live in the home at that point. But if the house is sold, the state gets their money first. Now, in Florida, I know it's a little bit different because Florida has some home protection rules, and I'm not sure exactly how it works down there for it. But that's why it's important to have a plan in place, to understand what you have and how you plan to deal with it, right? You can rely on government programs, right? Medicare does not cover long-term care, right? Medicare, if you want to be covered in a facility, basically you have to be in a hospital for 3 nights, for 3 days and that for it, and you can go directly to a facility at that point in time. They will pick up the first 20 days of coverage in that for it, and there's a copay for the next 70 days of coverage, right? So it's not a free program, and with Medicare, remember, if you go in to the hospital, you come out, and then you don't go in for another 60 days, you pick up another copay on Medicare, right? So if you go in, you go back in during that 60-day period for it, you're still covered. On day 61, if you haven't gone back in, now you're going back in for a different reason. Now it's not covered, you have to come up with the copay again. Roughly another $1,300 at that point, right? So it can be expensive, and then obviously Medicaid is, you spend down all of your assets and that for it. There's a 5-year look back in Illinois. There could be a 7-year look back at the national level, or depending on the state. Okay, but and some people say, well, I'll just give all my money away. So, well, that could work, as long as you can tell me when the 5-year period is going to start that you've given it away, that you won't need it. All right? Because if it's in that period, they will potentially, what they will do is they will just say, well, we're not going to provide benefits. And basically the people you gave the money to essentially have to come back up with the money to be able to provide, to cover that cost for that one, right? You've got to come up with that exclusion for it. Or you could potentially purchase either long-term care insurance or policies that could potentially cover that type of expense, right? So when you pay for long-term care, there's more freedom to choose, right? It may be ideal if you can afford to pay for the care indefinitely, but you must be willing to liquidate assets if necessary, right? The challenge can always be that what happens if we're liquidating assets in a down market. So it doesn't have to be your stock or bonds and that for it. Anybody remember what happened in 2008? What happened to your housing values? Did they go up or go down? They went down, right? So imagine having to liquidate your home at a time that A, someone knows you need to liquidate it, so you know you're not going to get the best price at that point, right? And B, it's during an economic downturn, right? So now you're definitely not going to get what you thought you might get out of it. So now the asset you thought, oh, I'll just sell the house and we'll move into here, all of a sudden if you thought you were going to get, I don't know, pick a number, $200,000, maybe now you're only getting $140,000, right? So now that you thought, oh, that will cover me for 3 or 4 years for, well, now maybe you're only covered for 2 years. All right. So starts to look at it. It also may impact the ability if you wanted to pass that property on to somebody else, right? So titling becomes very important of assets. So as I tell people, titling doesn't matter until it matters, and then once it matters, it's too late, right? So you have to make sure things are titled properly. So does anybody here have any assets that do not have a beneficiary listed on? Be it a savings account, a checking account, a life insurance. Have you updated those to make sure, if possible, you have contingent beneficiaries? So what happens if it's just two people that are, husband and wife, let's say on whatever the might be for policy or 401k, God forbid something happens to both of them at the same time. Now you've got to, if you don't have contingent beneficiaries listed, that could mean that you have a potential probate issue. All right. So it's important to go through and look at these. If you have safe deposit boxes, make sure that people can get access to the safe deposit boxes. If somebody's not on the box, not all banks will allow you to get into it. Right. So there's a number of challenges that could part of it, right? Paying for long-term care out of pocket, a reverse mortgage, so you can live at the home. So reverse mortgage, you can live in the home as long as you continue as your primary resident in that for it. You make no mortgage payments with regard to it. So essentially what they do is they're just building up the value of the mortgage at that point. You're repaying it that way for it. This way, when the house is sold, then they get their money and any residual would go to whoever you have for it. The reverse mortgage allows you to borrow against your home equity. You can use the cash to receive for long-term care payments, which means you could buy a long-term care potential policy with the payments for it. Also helps cover care as long as you remain in the home. So the key is you have to remain in the home and it has to be your primary residence. You cannot have a lake house and have your primary home and say, oh, well, I'll just put the second mortgage or the reverse mortgage on the lake house. You could, as long as it's your primary residence in that for it, right? So when you think about paying for long-term care, Medicare is a federal program of insurance that only limited coverage for long-term care assistance in that for it. So it pays costs only after a 3-day hospitalization. As I mentioned earlier, you have to be in the hospital at least 3 days before the payout is on it. It pays full cost of skilled care during only the first 20 days. All right. So if you need care, they want you basically in there for the first 20 days. You'll be covered in that for it. Partial pays costs from days 21 to day 100, and they pay nothing after day 100 on it. And it does not pay for personal or custodial care. So if you need someone to come to the house or you need assistance getting around to that for it, it's not going to cover any of those expenses in that for it. All right. So it's part of a plan, but it may not be the only plan that you need with which to cover these for it. Because as we saw earlier, 52% of people at some point in time are over age 65 are going to need assistance, right? And the statistics are, once you reach age 65, there's a high probability, especially today, given medical technology and that for it, that for males, at least age 85, or for females, most likely age 88, and for a married couple, one of the two, at least one of the two, making it into their 90s, maybe longer, right? So at some point in time, I don't know about you, but when I'm 95, I'm not sure if I'll be able to do the same things I did when I was 50, right? So it may be something that just needs to be considered when you start to take a look at it, right? Paying for long-term care, Medicaid, not Medicare, is the joint federal program. It pays for long-term care expenses. Medicaid is the largest public payer of long-term care services, right? Now, in order to be in a Medicaid facility, there's a couple of criteria. First is the facility has to be Medicaid eligible, right? So it has to be there for it. B is you must have spent down your assets, so that means whatever you have, you spent it down to roughly about $2,000. Your monthly Social Security or pensions would go toward the payment of your room, or therefore Medicaid would theoretically at that point pick up the difference. Medicaid, though, also has a couple of other challenges with it. First is there's not a bed reservation, meaning that if you were on Medicaid, and let's say you had to go into the hospital for it, and you were in the hospital for a couple of days, that facility can give your bed to somebody else. All right, and then you have to find another place for it. The other thing that they can also do, I believe, is they can have you in a facility up to 50 miles from where you currently reside. All right, so for this area here, they could have you down Joliet, maybe Kankakee, it might be close to 50 miles there. Going out northwest, you could be out in, potentially Rockford or somewhere like that, right? Which may or may not make it easy for either a spouse to get out there or for family members to get there if that's the case, right? Yes?
Okay, if you're on Medicaid, you said they go down to spend down to $2,000.
Correct.
What if you own a house?
They make the spend down. You have to sell the house. If you're in the facility at that point in time, you're selling the house, you're getting the cash of whatever the house has for it, and you're using that cash to spend down till you get to the $2,000. Essentially, you don't have any assets at that point in time.
You have to sell the house, or they put a lien.
Well, I guess you don't have to. They're going to put a lien on it, but if you're not occupying the house, then they're going to tell you to have the house sold so they can get the cash. Because quite honestly, the state doesn't want your house; they want the cash for it, right? So they're going to want that house sold, get the cash, then you use that cash to basically spend down again to get down to about that $2,000 level.
What if you're in a nursing home and you have Alzheimer's?
Well, then they'll make the decision for you, or someone in your facility, whoever is your power of attorney, would execute whatever needs to be done at that point in time. If not, just remember I talked about the state making decisions for you. If you're not in capacity and you have nobody there to make those decisions for you, guess who's going to make the decision for you? Right, the state's going to make it. They may have to wait until you pass, because then it would be a state issue, right? But there would be a lien, obviously, against the house. Yes.
So a person has a home and there's a joint tenant, like one of their children, joint tenant is an adult in some.
Not a spouse.
Right.
Okay.
Then that person would have to be selling the house or.
Correct. Because they're not a spouse.
Right.
Right. They were a spouse. The exclusion for remaining in the home applies only to spousal situations. Right. So husband and wife. Husband needs to go into facility for whatever reasons, Alzheimer's, just age, or whatever it might be, right? They spend down, in that particular instance, I believe it's about $80,000 that they get to keep as a joint asset for it. They get to keep a car, they get to keep the house, but again, in Illinois, once you do the spend down at that point to the $80,000, if in Illinois, what they will do is then put a lien on the property so that when the property is sold, or if somebody passes, right, the state will get the proceeds back from whatever they paid out. Right? If they paid out more than what the value of the house is, then obviously the state paid out to that could recover everything that was there for it.
So did I understand it has to be a spouse, it can't be a
Correct.
grown child?
It has to be a spouse. It's a spousal exemption, because they're basically, particularly in these terms, they're not going to kick your spouse out of your house. Right. If it's a child, though, it's a child and they're over a certain age, think they're an adult, they're going to not have them there. Yes, I'm sorry?
But your daughter's name be on the house.
Daughter's name could be on the house, but that doesn't mean that the house isn't going to be exempted from them potentially putting a lien or having you sell the property. Because it's not a spousal situation. This applies to spouses only, right? A spousal exclusion, essentially, right? I'm not trying to tell you to get married, but I mean, that would be a reason to do so. Yes?
If, trust, how does the trust come into play? Let's say,
Depends on what type of trust it is.
let's say it's irrevocable.
Irrevocable? So if it's irrevocable trust, the question is what happens in the titling of the house if it's an irrevocable trust. Well, an irrevocable trust, you've given that property away. As long as that property was given away more than 5 years before they had to start spending, the property would be excluded. If it is a revocable trust, though, it is still considered your asset and still would be able to have judgment against it. So that's the difference between irrevocable and revocable. Revocable is you can make changes to it. Irrevocable is I've given it away. It's not mine. I have no ownership in the property. Right. That's not only on a house, but that could be other assets as well. Okay. Okay. So Medicaid eligibility, each state establishes its own eligibility criteria under federal guidelines. In most states, an individual's income must be less than the cost of care. In some states, income cap applies, usually 300% of Social Security income benefit. In most states, again, I mentioned the asset limit is roughly about $2,000 to spend down, right? Again, if you're married, then right now it's about $80,000 for it. You get to keep a car, and therefore you can't keep 4 cars, right? You're only allowed to keep 1, right? And some assets are not counted. Your house, potentially, again in Illinois, it's not counted until they start spending down. Once they start spending down for it, then the state will put the lien on the property for it. It's just like having a second mortgage or that for it. And you are typically allowed 1 car. Household belongings are also allowed to be kept, as well as, it says on here, term life insurance. You can have a nominal life insurance policy, so you have a life insurance policy that's, let's say, $10,000 or something like that. It's not very much to help basically cover final expenses or that for it. And then you can also have a burial plot, and prepaid funeral expenses are excluded as part of that for it, right? Some places will require on a life insurance policy that the beneficiary of the policy be the nursing home or the center for that for it. In some instances I've had where the state has been made to be the beneficiary of the asset as well. Assuming the state is making a payout, right? So, strategies may include using assets that count, savings to purchase assets that don't, i.e. a small life, term life insurance policy or that for it. It cannot be like a $5 million policy. They will not allow something like that for it. That would be considered extravagant at that point. Transferring assets to an irrevocable trust. You could potentially do that, but again, if you're thinking that, there's a 5-year look back for it. So you say, I'll do it tomorrow, and then the next day you need the assistance or the care in that for it, they're going to pull those assets back in, right? So it has to be in that 5-year window, and it's a rolling 5-year window, right? So if I give something away today, 5 years from today would be exempted, right? So if I give something away tomorrow, 5 years from that would be. If it's 2 years from now I give something, so it's going to could have a rolling off period, so to speak, if that's the way you were to look at it, right? Distributing or protecting your assets in advance may help you qualify for Medicaid, but the question is, if you want to, do you want to be in a Medicaid, potentially Medicaid facility, right? They're not usually the best kept, but potentially facilities, and therefore, again, depending where you're at, right? So the benefits, if you qualify for Medicaid as soon as possible, you protect a healthy spouse. Again, they can potentially remain in the house, and that for it. You can potentially preserve some assets for your loved ones. Drawbacks, ethically problematic for some, may require to give up rights to your assets. And Medicaid laws are complex, and again, they do vary per state. While the federal government provides the assets, or the financial, most of the financial backing for Medicaid, each state is responsible for its implementation of the Medicaid program. Right? So it's a state managed program, and it's funded by the federal government. So basically us. Right? So you can transfer ownership of a house to your son. Let's say the fair market value is $400,000. Average cost of nursing home care is $8,000. Ineligibility period is 50 months at that point, right? So they would say, okay, if you gave the house away today, you needed care tomorrow and that for it, there's going to be 50 months that they're not going to provide anything for at $8,000 a month for. So one of two things has to happen. Either you come up with the $8,000 a month, which if you say you don't have the $8,000 a month, it's kind of hard to do, right? Or guess what's happening? We're going to sell the house to raise the $400,000 to basically be able to pay the care, right? So while they did not directly ask or tell the son to sell the house, I guess they could say, "Mom, you're up the creek. You know, we own the house. We have a nice life, right?" They could, I guess, right, since they own the house. But assuming they don't do that, they're essentially taking back any of those assets, right? So if you give $20,000 to your grandson for college, or that for it, and all of a sudden it turns out that you need the proceeds, guess what? They're going to use the exclusion and say if it's $8,000 a month, there's essentially 2.5 months they're not going to pay for. Somebody's got to come up with that $20,000, right? Yes.
How does it work out with, say you have a joint account, and say you have your kid, let's say, use this example, I have $100,000. Both of my kids is a joint account.
Owners. They're owners on the account.
Owners on the account, so they can only really come back with 50,000.
Potentially, because it's an ownership asset, right?
Now,
But in that case, there's complexity with it because if you're primary on it, it could be viewed as it's all primarily yours unless they're showing that they can potentially deposit money and transactions on the account. So it can get complex. I mean, there's some other things that go along with it. Just because somebody's on an account, just because I'm on my dad's account doesn't mean I'm really on the account. I'm on it to be able to pay bills or whatever for, right? But I'm not really an owner because I'm not putting any money into it, right? So unless I'm putting money into the account, then they could potentially track back and say, you are well on ownership title, you're not owner of asset, potentially.
How would they know that that's your son's giving you money to put into the account, so how can they make that decision?
That's why you have to provide all 5 years worth of records.
So they would have to show like a check deposit.
They would have to show deposits, they're gonna look at withdrawals. I mean, I always caution people, if you get into a situation where you're gonna be on an account with someone and then for it, make sure that you write checks for everything, right? Or you go online and you do a bank check for that, or you go online and have your bank have a bill. Because if you don't, let's say for example, you're on your parents' account or you're a power of attorney on your parents' account, right? And you say, okay, I'm gonna take $1,000 out because mom and dad I need to get some prescriptions and I need to pay off this and we need to get this for it, right? When you come back and they do the 5-year look back and they say, okay, where's this $1,000? What did you buy it? What did you use it for?
Glasses.
Show it. They want to see it. Right? So they want to see that you bought glasses. They want to see you bought prescriptions. They want to see you took $1,000 out on Monday and Tuesday you went and bought glasses and prescriptions and whatever it was, right? Otherwise, how do they know that you didn't take that $1,000, right, and go to Vegas? They don't know, right? So that's why I always suggest to people to write a check. If you write a check to Walgreens for for $52, right? It wasn't you that it went to, right? It went to Walgreens, and so the idea would be that I'm just picking Walgreens as an entity, right? It went to Walgreens, they paid the bill, they go back, oh, we can track it back, right? So I always suggest that you do that because if there's no paper trail, you're going to be responsible for the paper trail. And if you don't have the receipts and everything to prove whatever dollars you took out of it, guess what they're going to do? They're going to exempt. They're going to say, no, that's you kept that money. You either stole it, you did something else with it. It wasn't part of it, so we want that $1,000 back. All right. But if you have tracking for it, use your credit card, right? You use a credit card. We run check to the credit card. Use the credit card statement. If you do that, I suggest that you have one card that you just use for that person. You get a brand new card. Nothing goes on that card except for expenses that are associated with mom or dad or aunt, uncle, whoever it is that you're doing it for, right? Because then you can track it back, right? And you can show everything that if you wrote a check to, I don't know, MasterCard, let's say, right? That you can say, okay, this MasterCard was used for these expenses. You can give them a copy of the MasterCard bill, right? Say, here's all the expenses, what was all used for, right? So it's something. It sounds like it's difficult. It is. But as you remember, they're basically going through this to make sure that these assets were used appropriately for the person that they were supposed to be used for, right? So looking for pay for long-term care insurance, benefits paid when you need them for extended care, especially valuable for middle-income Americans who want to preserve financial independence along with their quality of life. You do get the freedom to choose for most policies. You can choose where you want to be as opposed to a Medicaid where you don't, right? It can help preserve assets in that form. So how does long-term care insurance work? You must be reasonably good health to buy a policy. Policy premiums are based on age, and the features and benefits you get to choose from it. Benefits typically triggered when you become chronically ill or cognitively impaired and need 2 of 6 ADLs, eating, bathing, toileting, transferring, continence. There's always one I forget. You need any of those, 2 of those 6, or mental incompetency in that for it, then the policies will kick in for it. Once an elimination period, typically it's a 90-day elimination period, which means you're waiting 90 days before they do payments on it. But if you think in terms, if you go into the hospital and then go into a facility at that point, you've got 100 days essentially for Medicare, right, to help cover some of it. So at that point in time, the long-term care insurance could kick in. You can buy 0 elimination. If you do 0 elimination, then obviously it starts earlier, but the cost of that insurance is obviously going to cost more at that point. So long-term care features, they have 5 key features for it. So the benefit, what is the